Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Florence the Machine titled How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful. Well, I'm pretty much obliged to cover this, not because I've been getting requests for it, although I have been, but more because I think that every single girlfriend I've ever had has been a Florence the Machine fan. And if I didn't say something, well, I'd probably hear about it. But really, I couldn't blame them for that, because Florence the Machine is one of those acts I always thought deserved to get a lot bigger than they have. When they smashed onto the scene in 2009 with the album Lungs and anthemic songs like Dog Days Are Over or Kiss the Fist, a lot of critics drew comparison with artists like Fiona Apple or PJ Harvey or especially Kate Bush. Now, I would not go that far, especially on the last one, but there was often a desperate power behind Florence's vocals that lacked a lot of subtlety, but it had a ton of presence, which is often enough to allow you to overlook the fact that the lyricism could occasionally stray into clumsiness. And that the instrumentation wasn't really as raw as it could have been. Hell, you could make the argument that without Florence and the Machine in some way, you wouldn't have so many acts in mainstream pop hammering the percussion groove over melody as has been popular over the past couple of years. Although Florence and the Machine did play and make it sound pretty along the way, so I'll give them that. So with all that in mind, why the hell isn't Florence and the Machine more popular, like on the pop charts? Well, I argue part of it is that they never really played the pop game, especially in the lightweight silliness in the beginning of the club boom in 2009. Some of it might tie back to the fact that Florence and the Machine fall into a very similar area where most power pop ends up. Too heavy and loud for pop radio, yet not quite rock-edged enough to really rock harder. And part of it might just be that Florence Welch's intensity can be kind of a hard sell. Granted, I'm not sure I buy that anymore given the recent success of acts like Sia or Tove Lo. Hell, even Florence landed on the charts thanks to goddamn Calvin Harris of all people making everything worse like he usually does. Or you know what, maybe some of it was just bad timing. Their follow-up record Ceremonies dropped in 2011, and yet had the misfortune of going up against 21 by Adele, which took Florence and the Machine's percussion-heavy formula and one of their main producers, Paul Epworth, and brought a level of tightness to the writing that Florence never really quite mastered. Yes, I get that a voice like Florence's doesn't exactly need subtlety to make impact with an audience, but eventually cranking every single chorus to 11 loses some power for me when you don't have adequate melodic crescendos or stronger lyrical punch, especially when she goes for so much self-serious gravitas and, let's be honest, kind of melodramatic. But after 4 years away from the spotlight, Florence and the Machine are back. Apparently after Florence went through one of the most difficult points in her life, having a bit of a nervous breakdown according to her, which places this record as probably going to be her most personal. So, okay, did all that pan out? Honestly, I'm not sure that it does. This is one of the many frustrating elements about this frustrating record, because it's an easy example of a band definitely taking some of the steps in the right direction, but there are certain issues that have persisted beyond the changes and have only come across as more glaring now. And it's hard to parse out where to assign the blame for here. Producers Marcus Straubs or Paul Epworth, the backing band, or Florence herself. And the exasperating thing is that none of it makes the album bad per se, just kind of weaker and lacking in more impact than it really should have. In other words, the record is decent, but I'm sorry, I will not call this great. So okay, let's start off with Florence herself. And you know what? It's time to be brutally honest with you all. I've never loved her as a vocalist. I know, borderline heresy, but for as much as I respect her pipes and her range and her intensity, I'm also coming across as a fan of symphonic and power metal, which has plenty of women with some of the most striking vocal talents in the music industry. Hell, I'm a little bit amazed that Florence hasn't gone more in this direction, especially given her brand of songwriting. She'd be a natural fit for it. But more often than not, she tends to fall into Christina Aguilera territory for me. Incredible pipes and a lot of intensity, but doesn't always feel visceral to bring the emotions forth beyond just sheer volume. It's the difference between a broad wallop and a precise cut, and the heavy multi-tracking, which Florence has never needed, only intensifies this problem. The odd thing is that on this record, especially in the back half, it actually tries to get Florence to ease back a little bit on the histrionics for songs like Long and Lost and St. Jude, and she's honestly pretty good here, bringing a pretty potent tension to the songs and showing off some real vulnerability here. And believe it or not, the writing actually supports this too. Now, it's not without my usual gripes with Florence and the Machine's songwriting. Bog standard metaphors cribbed from classical mythology and legend, pretty basic songwriting structures, a tendency to slip into a lot of cliches, but there are improvements here, most notably in the framing. Thematically, this record appears to be something around a breakup album, but Florence does plenty to highlight the fact that her own behavior hasn't exactly helped things. Ship direct sets the scene very early, with Florence questioning her own reckless rationale for instigating a relationship in the first place, and probably how she isn't a good fit for the aloof dreamer that she describes on What Kind of Man. And you know what, she's probably right about that, and she does sell that as believable, that crisis of faith faith. And yet on the title track, she describes how she clung to that relationship even when they were apart for too long and worked to appease the situation doomed to fail on Queen of Peace. Thankfully, she finally made the choice to end the relationship, at least on the inside in her thoughts. But then we hit the centerpiece of the album, Delilah, where the recklessness spirals out of control as she does everything she can do to possibly distance herself from waiting for his call. Now, I'm kind of conflicted about this song. It seems to imply nothing so bad as this reckless distraction and drinking, but the references to dancing with Delilah, referencing the biblical myth, and lyrics like "it's one more boy and one more lie" imply something a little bit darker, an attempt to strike back and pierce his distance through maybe infidelity. It makes the remorse and frustration of lingering feelings in the next couple songs, it makes sense until she finally makes the choice on St. Jude to just finally give up and end it already, and that whole lost cause. Good metaphor there. And what works here is the framing. I can buy this. The larger context of the album implies that she'd been better off ending this early, but she instead allowed herself to get strung along. She stuck with it, and none of her reckless behavior around is particularly glorified. Hell, Third Eye makes that framing all the more literal as she counsels a friend to break free of the same sort of hold. And I kind of appreciate the sequencing of this album, as it might have been that moment outside of herself that spurs her into action. Really, I'd argue that the writing might be the best part of this album. The problem is that the production does nothing to highlight that. I'm genuinely shocked that Marcus Drops, who worked with Bjork on Homogenic, helped to produce this, because I get so little intimacy from Florence's vocals thanks to the replacement midway through the mix, the multi-tracking, and all the reverb. And that's a real problem on a record that's supposed to feel raw and heartfelt, even if she is trying to bottle up some of those feelings inside. Granted, this is an issue with the production across the board. On the one hand, the band finally seems to be moving in a more melodic direction, big positive with this album, with the most obvious addition being the full horn section. But it's used more as musical punctuation than in actually holding a melody line. Instead, we just get the fluttering guitars and keys as Ship Direct that actually rides a pretty solid bass line. Want to hear more of it? The heavier guitar crunch of What Kind of Man, probably my favorite song on the album. The stately bombast of Queen of Peace with the strings, horns, and the heavier bass. Or the rollicking panic of Delilah that builds off a seething organ and piano line and some decent snarl on the backing side. But this leads us to the first of many issues with the production, that it's simply overstuffed and not emphasizing the right things. This has been an issue on previous Florence the Machine albums, but it's only more glaring here. The bizarre thing is that overloading Florence's voice with so much multi-tracking and effects that she doesn't need. Well, not only was the intimacy completely neutered, but it also drowns out more of the actual melodies driving these tracks, with only jingling percussion and thicker beats consistently coming through. And not only does this mean that the guitar licks are just crushed into this slurry, that it gives none of the melodies trying to add dramatic climax to the choruses any of the focus. And while I wasn't expecting any grit with this album, Florence's production is way too polished for that. It does mean that more of the choruses just kind of run together and feel a little bit interchangeable to me, which is not good on an album where songs frequently run over 4 minutes and don't do enough to really earn it. This entire album screams of indulgence, especially when there's no real solos and the songs are piled with more decadent classical elements without the slightest hint of restraint behind it. Now, the absolute worst case for me is Mother, which had a decent steamy guitar lick and bass line anchoring the melody before this heavily multi-tracked shouting chorus is added that doesn't fit at all with the vibe of the song, before an ugly lo-fi fuzz is smeared over the back end that switches again as the backing vocals piled on. The tone abruptly becomes cleaner with this blast of cymbals. It's not progressive, it's just a mess, and it doesn't fit at all with the rest of the album. Easily the worst song, probably the worst song that Florence the Machine has ever done. Now look, I get maximalism as a trait of all Florence the Machine records, but it's rare that I've seen an album hammer for epic bombast so hard and yet miss the mark, especially when the songwriting would have been better suited for more instrumental restraint, or at least more nuance behind it. As much as I can respect Florence's voice and a lot of her writing, her producers completely oversold her on this record to the expense of the rest of the band, which is honestly a damn shame because the melodic grooves on this album are pretty solid when they aren't being crushed by percussion or sloppy layering. What Kind of Man, Ship Direct, and Delilah, they're proof of that. And you know what? At the end of the day, the record still does kind of feel lacking in raw edge across the board, which sure might be the point of the songwriting straining for release and not having that edge, but it doesn't help the overall impact of the record. In other words, I feel that I'm a lot more underwhelmed by this album than I should be. I'm thinking that's about a 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore Florence and the Machine fan. Otherwise, look, Licky Lee explored a lot of similar themes on her last album, I Never Learned, and despite being drenched in more reverb than I think anybody expected, the writing the melodies hit me a lot harder, so I'd honestly recommend you check that out instead. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Please keep it civil in the comments. Guys, I really wanted to like this album, but I was just really underwhelmed by it. Sorry. But if there's anything else you want me to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.